That contract is a trap, Alina Brooks said. And the room forgot how to breathe. The words did not come out loud, but they landed hard enough to crack the polished silence stretching across the 32nd floor boardroom. 1 second earlier, Richard Halston had been smiling. That smooth, practiced smile of a man who owned too much to ever doubt a room, a deal, or the people trembling around him. The skyline burned behind him in gold afternoon light. Glass, steel, power, all of it reflecting off the black conference table like the city itself had come to watch him win. Then Alina spoke, and his smile paused. She stood near the side wall in a Navy maintenance uniform that hung too plain for a room like this. An ID badge clipped near her collar, a stack of empty water glasses still cold in her hands. No one had noticed her until that moment. That was the rule for girls like Alina. Enter quietly, clean the edges, disappear before the powerful had to remember you had a face. But Alina had seen the clause, and once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. "Excuse me," one of the attorneys muttered, turning with a frown sharp enough to cut paper. "What did you just say?" A few people laughed under their breath. Not because anything was funny, but because cruelty often entered a room dressed like amusement. Richard leaned back in his chair, expensive cufflinks flashing once beneath the recessed lights. He looked at her the way men like him looked at interruptions. Cool, distant, already half dismissed. "You're telling me," he said, voice soft with disbelief, "that you understand a contract my legal team has reviewed for 3 weeks?" Alina felt every eye in the room slide over her skin, measuring the badge, the uniform, the color of her hands, the place she was supposed to stay in. But her voice did not shake. "No, sir," she said. "I'm telling you this clause was written to make you feel protected, while it quietly hands the collapse to you." The room went still in a different way then. Not mockery. Not yet. This was the silence that comes when truth walks into a room uninvited and sits at the head of the table. Richard's fingers, resting beside the open contract, stopped moving. His smile did not vanish all at once. It thinned first, then cooled, then held perfectly still like a mask that suddenly weighed too much to wear. Alina took 1 step closer, heartbeat loud in her throat, and pointed to the page without touching it. "Paragraph 14, she said, buried under the compliance language. "But if the merger fails, the liability doesn't stay with the seller. It rolls forward and lands on you." Nobody laughed this time, because the most dangerous person in a room is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one who was never supposed to speak at all. For 3 full seconds, no one moved, and in rooms like that, silence was never empty. It was hierarchy, calculation, the quiet rustle of people deciding who was allowed to be right. Alina stood with her shoulders straight, though her pulse was beating so hard she could feel it behind her eyes. The air conditioning hummed through the vents above, cold enough to sting the dampness in her palms, and the city beyond the glass looked distant now. Too bright, too clean, too far away from where people like her usually stood. Richard Halston lowered his gaze to the contract again, but the men around him did not. They kept staring at Alina the way powerful people stare at disruption, not with curiosity but offense. One executive near the far end of the table gave a short, humorless laugh. "This is absurd," he said, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against a notepad. "She's on the facilities crew." Another leaned back and adjusted his tie. "And somehow now she's doing legal review?" The words were polished, but the message underneath them was old, familiar, and mean. Alina had heard versions of it her whole life. In school hallways, at checkout counters, in offices where people smiled at her mother with their mouths and dismissed her with their eyes. The language changed depending on the zip code, but contempt always found a way to sound educated. Richard still said nothing. That was what unsettled her most. If he had laughed, she could have braced for it. If he had snapped, she could have endured it. But this stillness from him felt heavier, like he had stepped back inside himself to look at something nobody else in the room could yet see. Alina swallowed and kept her voice low, measured. "The indemnity language is dressed up as protection," she said, "but the trigger event is written so broadly it catches every post-close dispute. even the ones caused before your company takes control. A woman from the legal team turned sharply. Who told you that? Alina looked at her. No one. Her answer hung there without decoration. Because the truth did not need to be expensive to be true. Across the table, one of the junior associates reached for the printed copy like his hand moved before his pride could stop it. Pages whispered. I scanned. Someone zoomed in on a tablet. The room began to fracture. Not loudly, but in tiny signs of doubt. A brow tightening. A throat clearing. The small, ugly panic of people realizing the invisible girl might be the only one who was actually paying attention. Alina could feel the moment turning, but it did not make her feel victorious. Only tired. Tired in the old way. The way people get when they know being right will cost them more than being wrong ever costs the powerful. Richard finally looked up at her again. His face had changed. Not softened. Not yet. But the easy certainty was gone, and in its place was something rarer in men like him. Discomfort sharpened by recognition. What's your name? He asked. The question should have been simple. But in that room it felt late. Alina held his gaze. Alina Brooks, sir. He repeated it once, quieter this time, as if the room needed to learn it now that it could no longer pretend she was part of the furniture. And for the first time since she spoke, Alina understood the real danger of truth. It doesn't just expose the trap. It exposes everyone who was comfortable standing beside it. Richard Halston did not raise his voice, and somehow that made the room feel even colder. He sat at the head of the black glass table with one hand resting beside the open contract, thumb pressed lightly against the page as if he could feel the lie pulsing beneath the paper. Around him, the executives had gone stiff in their tailored suits, each one trying to look composed while uncertainty moved through the room like a draft under a locked door. Then Richard leaned back. Slow, controlled, every inch of him still carrying the authority that had built towers, bought silence, and made entire industries bend. Before breakfast. Everyone out, he said. Not loud. Not dramatic, but final. A few people blinked, unsure they had heard him right. Except lead counsel, he added, eyes never leaving the page. Chairs shifted. Leather side. A dozen expensive people began collecting tablets, pens, pride. Yet even as they stood, some of them looked toward Alina with open irritation, as if she had broken something sacred simply by speaking above her station. One man brushed past her with a muttered, "Unbelievable." Another didn't bother lowering his voice. This is what happens when staff forget boundaries. Alina kept her face still, but the words landed where words like that always landed. Deep, familiar, old. She had learned young that some people only respected intelligence after it came dressed in money. Anything else, especially in black skin and a maintenance badge, felt like an insult to the order they trusted. The last of them filed out, and the room seemed to widen in their absence. The skyline glowed behind the windows, all amber light and long shadows, while inside the boardroom the air felt sharper, cleaner, dangerous in a quieter way. Richard's lead attorney, a white-haired man named Gregory Sloan, adjusted his glasses and reached for the marked section. He read once, then again. The color changed in his face so subtly most people would have missed it. But Alina saw it. Richard saw it too. Well? Richard asked. Gregory cleared his throat. She is not wrong. The words came out dry, reluctant, each one resisting the next. Richard's jaw tightened. Not wrong, he repeated, as if the phrase offended him more than the clause itself. Gregory turned another page. It's more than unfavorable language, he said carefully. It creates a rollover exposure event tied to any inherited litigation, without a meaningful limitation period. If signed as drafted, Halston Capital absorbs the downstream risk. Richard's gaze lifted, and this time when he looked at Alina, he was not looking at a maintenance worker who had interrupted him. He was looking at the only person in the room who had told him the truth before the ink dried. That kind of recognition was not warm. It was unsettling. Because powerful men can survive opposition, what they struggle to survive is clarity. Richard stood, buttoned his suit jacket once, then walked around the table toward her. Not fast, Not angry, just deliberate enough to make the space between them feel charged. He stopped a few feet away. How? He asked, voice lower now. Did you catch something my team missed? And for the first time since she spoke, the room no longer belonged to his status. It belonged to her answer. Alina did not answer right away. Not because she was afraid, but because she had spent enough of her life learning that in rooms built by powerful men, the truth was never judged only by its accuracy. It was judged by who dared to carry it in. Richard stood a few feet from her now, close enough for her to catch the clean scent of cedar and starch rising from his suit, close enough to see that whatever had once made him untouchable in this room had shifted into something harder, something watchful. Gregory Sloane remained by the table, one hand still resting on the contract, his expression drawn tight with the quiet humiliation of a man who had just discovered his credentials had not protected him from missing the obvious. Outside the windows, late afternoon light bled over Manhattan in long bands of copper and gray. But inside, the room had narrowed to a single question. Alina set the empty glasses down on the side credenza with care, as if sudden movements would cheapen what had just happened. My mom works nights on this floor, she said. Sometimes I help her finish before the cleaning crew clocks out. Richard's face did not change, but his silence told her to continue. The draft was left in the auxiliary print room, she said. Half the pages were stacked wrong. I was straightening them before I threw the extras into shredding. Gregory inhaled, already offended. You read a confidential acquisition document while wearing a facilities badge? Alina turned toward him, calm but not apologetic. I read the first page because the numbering was off. Then I noticed the liability section didn't read like protection. It read like bait. The word hung in the air with a rough, honest weight to it. Richard's eyes sharpened. Bait, he repeated. Yes, sir. Alina folded her hands in front of her, not submissive, steady. The wording is polished, but the structure is wrong. It reassures you at the beginning of the section, then broadens the trigger language 2 lines later. That's what made me stop. Gregory let out a dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. And you saw that from one read-through? Alina met his stare. No, I saw it because I've seen that shape before. For the first time, Richard's expression changed in a way that wasn't about control. It was interest, reluctant but real. Where? He asked. The question pulled something older into her chest. She glanced once at the contract, then back at him. My father signed papers he didn't understand when I was 11, she said quietly. Not a merger. Nothing like this. Just refinancing language, medical debt, a business guarantee he thought would help keep our family repair shop open. The first paragraph sounded like relief. The middle buried the damage. By the time anybody explained it in plain English, the shop was gone. And so was everything attached to it. No one spoke. Even Gregory's posture shifted. Because pain, when spoken plainly, has a way of stripping the polish off a room. Alina's voice stayed even, but the memory moved beneath it like a current. After that, I started reading things differently. Loan forms, notices, contracts people leave around because they think the wrong person won't understand them anyway. Richard looked at her for a long moment, and something in his gaze darkened. Not with anger, but with recognition of a kind he likely hated. Men like him were used to being protected by systems. Alina had been trained by what those systems did when they failed you. So this wasn't luck, he said. No, sir, she answered. Luck is when danger misses your door. This, she glanced at the open contract on the table. This was written to walk right through yours. The stillness that followed carried a different weight now. Not disbelief, not mockery, but the first cold outline of something bigger than embarrassment. Richard turned back toward the contract, his jaw tightening once, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its ease entirely. Then this wasn't negligence, he said. It was aimed, and in that instant the room changed again. Because a mistake can be corrected, but a trap with intention means someone wanted Richard Halston ruined, and Alina Brooks had just become the only reason he wasn't. Richard did not sit back down. He remained standing at the end of the table, one hand on the chair he had pushed away, eyes fixed on the contract. As if the paper itself had turned hostile in his hands. Gregory Sloane adjusted his glasses again, buying himself time, but the room had already passed the point where composure could repair it. Once a man like Richard realizes he was almost led to the edge on purpose, every polished detail begins to look like a fingerprint. Who drafted the final language? Richard asked. Gregory glanced at the signature block, then at the redlined markup on his tablet. Primary revisions came in from outside counsel on the seller's side, he said carefully. Our team reviewed the summary deck, then the clean version. Richard's gaze lifted, sharp enough to stop him. That wasn't my question. Gregory's throat worked once. The revised clause was approved through Elias Ventnor's office. The name settled into the room with the dull weight of old rivalry. Alina didn't know Ventnor personally, but she knew the type, men whose smiles always arrived before their honesty did. Richard's jaw flexed. Of course it was, he said almost to himself. Then he turned to Gregory with a stillness more cutting than anger. 3 weeks of legal review, and the person who catches the poison is the woman collecting water glasses. Gregory's face paled, not from shame alone, but from the deeper sting of having his failure spoken plainly. Richard, with respect, no one could have anticipated. No, Richard cut in, voice low. What no one anticipated was that someone you were trained to overlook would actually be paying attention. The words landed harder than any raised voice. Alina felt them too, though they were not spoken to hurt her. They named something she had lived inside for years, that dangerous convenience wealthy people rely on, the belief that the invisible cannot witness them clearly. Gregory looked away first. That small movement told its own story. Richard turned back toward Alina, and for one flicker of a second she thought the room might finally bend toward fairness. But power rarely changes direction without resistance. The boardroom doors opened again, and a woman in a charcoal suit stepped in with the crisp urgency of upper management. Her name was Dana Mercer, Chief Operations Officer, silver watch, perfect posture, the kind of executive who could make disapproval sound like procedure. Her eyes moved from Richard to Gregory to Alina and sharpened instantly. Is there a reason facilities is still in this room? She asked. The old humiliation came back so fast it was almost physical. Not because Alina had never heard that tone before, but because it arrived right after truth had finally been acknowledged, as if the world could not bear to let her keep that ground for more than a minute. Richard did not answer right away. Dana looked at Alina again, this time with the careful politeness people use when they want to remind you that your presence is temporary. Ms. Brooks, isn't it? She said. Thank you for... Whatever confusion led to this interruption. Someone downstairs can help you return to your assigned floor. The words were neat, expensive, and ruthless. Confusion. As if what Alina had uncovered was a misunderstanding instead of a warning. Alina held her gaze. She could feel the familiar pull to shrink, to leave cleanly, to make everyone else more comfortable with what had just happened. But dignity, she had learned, was often just the decision not to disappear on command. It wasn't confusion, she said quietly. Dana's expression cooled. This is no longer your concern. It became my concern when I recognized a trap before your team did. Silence. Immediate, dangerous silence. Gregory stared at the table. Dana's eyes hardened with the offense of a woman and used to being corrected by someone she considered beneath the architecture of the room. For a beat, no one moved. Then Richard stepped between them. Not dramatically, not protectively, but decisively enough to redraw the air itself. She stays, he said. Dana blinked once, as if the sentence had arrived in the wrong language. Richard's voice remained level. And from this moment on, no one in this building refers to what she did as confusion. Not unless they want to admit they were comfortable signing a knife with my name on it. He turned slightly, just enough for Alina to see that the certainty in him had come back. But it was no longer the certainty of a man assuming he was safe. It was the colder, cleaner certainty of a man who finally knew he had been targeted, and who had just decided that the only person in the room he could trust was the one everyone else had wanted removed. The room did not erupt after Richard spoke. It emptied. That was somehow more powerful. Dana Mercer's mouth closed on whatever she had been about to say, and for one suspended second the only sound left was the low breath of the ventilation system moving through the ceiling. Then Richard gave 3 clipped instructions. Freeze the signing, lock down every circulated draft, pull all access logs from legal and print services, and people moved with the fast, quiet obedience that only comes when money finally smells danger. Within minutes, the boardroom that had felt crowded with tailored certainty turned hollow, almost sacred in its silence. Dana left first, heels sharp against the marble, carrying her offense with the straight spine of someone already planning how to survive being wrong. Gregory followed with 2 associates and a stack of documents pressed too tightly against his chest. The doors shut behind them, and just like that, the room belonged to no one but Alina, Richard, and the long black table that had almost witnessed his downfall. Alina stood near the side credenza, hands folded lightly in front of her, trying to slow her breathing without making it obvious. Adrenaline had carried her this far. Now it was leaving, and in its place came the delayed tremor, the private cost of standing upright in a room designed to make you feel small. Richard walked back to the window wall and stopped there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the marked contract at his side. Outside, Manhattan had shifted into evening. The glass towers across the avenue caught the last orange light and gave it back in broken pieces. Far below, traffic moved like veins of red and white across wet-looking streets, though the sky was clear. Alina had cleaned this room enough times to know how it looked after hours. Polished, expensive, almost unreal. But she had never seen it like this, stripped of performance, full of consequences. Richard stared out at the city for so long she began to wonder whether he had forgotten she was still there. Then he spoke without turning around. "You know what the worst part is?" His voice was quieter now. Not soft, just unguarded in a way she hadn't heard before. Alina said nothing. Men like him usually asked questions they intended to answer themselves. "It's not that someone tried to corner me," he said. "That's business. Ugly business. But still business." He looked down once at the contract in his hand. "It's that. They almost succeeded because everyone in that room was trained to listen upward, never outward." The words settled deep, because that was the truth beneath the truth. A trap on paper was one thing. A culture built to ignore the wrong people was another. Alina looked at the lights reflecting in the black glass table and thought of her mother mopping these floors after midnight. Always careful, always invisible, making rooms shine for people who never learned her name. "People don't miss warning signs by accident," she said quietly. Richard turned then, finally facing her. His expression had changed again. Less like a billionaire managing fallout, more like a man standing in the ruins of his own assumptions. "No," he said. "They miss them because comfort is loud, and humility barely speaks above a whisper." The room went still after that. Not tense, not cruel, just still in the honest way silence becomes when pretense leaves it alone. Alina did not know what would come next. She did not know whether this strange pause between them would harden back into distance by morning, or open into something neither of them knew how to name. But for the first time since she walked into that room, she was no longer standing there as an interruption. She was standing there as the reason the night had changed. The knock came 22 minutes later, soft, controlled, almost polite. Richard glanced toward the boardroom door, then at the digital clock glowing in the wall panel beside the credenza. 6:42 p.m. In the world below, the city had moved fully into evening. Office windows lit like rows of held breath, headlights threading through the avenues, the whole skyline pretending calm while people inside it made choices that could ruin lives before dinner. "Come in," Richard said. The door opened, and Dana Mercer stepped back inside with a slim black folder in her hand, her posture as exact as ever. But something in her face had thinned. Not fear, not yet. Just the first strain of someone realizing the facts are beginning to choose sides. "We pulled the access logs," she said. Her eyes flicked once toward Alina, then away again, as though respect still cost her more than she wanted to pay. There were 3 print pulls from auxiliary legal before the meeting. One from Gregory's assistant, one from outside counsel, and 1 manual override. From the executive archive terminal. Richard's gaze sharpened. That terminal requires authorization. Dana nodded. It was used under a temporary credential issued this morning. She opened the folder and slid out a sheet. Approved by Elias Ventnor's office, but routed through internal compliance to bypass the normal legal chain. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel in the ribs. Alina did not move. She watched Richard's face instead. The way his expression didn't explode, didn't crack, didn't even rise. Settled. That was worse. Some men get louder when they are threatened. Men like Richard got still. And that kind of stillness meant the truth had stopped being theory. He took the paper from Dana and read it once. Then again. Slower. So the altered clause didn't just come from outside, he said. It was escorted into my building. Dana's jaw tightened. Yes. Richard let out a breath so faint it barely disturbed the air. And internal compliance signed off? Deputy compliance, Dana said. Not senior. Name. Martin Keene. Richard nodded once, but his eyes had already gone elsewhere. Farther. Alina understood then what he was really seeing. Not a forged approval. Not one bad actor. Pattern. Corridor. A path someone had built through layers of trusted procedure, counting on status to protect the lie until it reached his desk. That was the ugliest kind of trap. The kind that borrows the language of order so nobody notices the sabotage until it has a title and a timestamp. Dana hesitated, then added, "There's more." She pulled a second page from the folder. Ventnor's people shorted their review cycle by 48 hours, and 2 shell entities tied to the seller were positioned to absorb market fallout if Halston Capital took the liability hit. Richard looked up slowly. They were going to profit from my collapse. Dana didn't answer because she didn't need to. The numbers had already spoken. Richard turned his head toward the window for 1 long second, city light catching the edge of his profile. And when he looked back, the truth was fully there now, cold and complete. This wasn't a bad deal, he said. It was an execution dressed like paperwork. No one in the room argued. Because once a thing is named correctly, even expensive people lose the power to soften it. Alina felt a chill move through her, not from fear of him, but from the scale of what she had interrupted without even knowing it. She had thought she was stopping a dangerous clause. She had not understood she had stepped into the middle of a planned downfall with billion-dollar timing and polished hands all over it. Richard looked at her then. Not past her, not through her, but at her with the kind of recognition that changes the air between 2 people permanently. If you hadn't spoken, he said, voice low and exact, by tomorrow morning I would have been thanking the men who tried to bury me. Dana lowered her eyes. Alina held his gaze. She didn't answer because there was nothing to decorate. The truth was already standing in the room between them. Clear, unsparing, alive. And in that moment, Richard Halston finally understood the full measure of what had happened. Not that a black woman in a maintenance uniform had embarrassed his team, but that the only honest shield he had that night came from the one person everyone else had been trained not to see. Richard set the folder down with a care that felt heavier than anger, as if even the table deserved more respect than the people who had tried to use it as a burial ground. Dana remained still across from him, waiting, but the sharpness she wore like armor had begun to thin around the edges. Gregory was gone. The lawyers were gone. The room was stripped down now to what mattered most, and that made every word more expensive. Richard looked at Alina again, then at the maintenance badge clipped near her collar, and for the first time that night there was no distance in his gaze. Only the uncomfortable clarity of a man facing the architecture of his own blindness. "How long have you been working in this building?" he asked. Alina hesitated. The question sounded simple, but nothing in that room was simple anymore. "I help my mother on night shifts 3 evenings a week," she said. "Since January." Richard nodded once, absorbing the number like it had weight. January. Months of polished floors, empty trash bins, wiped glass, silent elevators, and hundreds of chances for people in tailored clothes to notice the woman standing 3 feet from their conversations. They hadn't. Dana's voice came carefully this time, stripped of some of its earlier steel. Ms. Brooks. She stopped, as though the name felt different in her mouth now. What you flagged tonight. It changed the outcome of more than one deal. Alina looked at her, not with triumph, just with the calm fatigue of someone who had no energy left for theater. I wasn't trying to change an outcome, she said. I was trying to stop a lie before it got signed. Richard's mouth tightened. Not in irritation, but in the kind of respect men like him often arrive at too late. He moved back to the head of the table, then stopped short of sitting, as if the chair no longer fit the version of himself that had walked into the room an hour earlier. Do you know what the people in this building are trained to value most? He asked. Alina said nothing. He answered anyway. Presentation, confidence, titles, polished language. We reward the performance of certainty. He glanced down at the marked contract. And tonight, all of that nearly cost me everything. The city glowed around them, endless windows lit against the dark, 1,000 private lives stacked above the streets. Alina thought of her mother downstairs, probably halfway through the west corridor by now, headphones in one ear, knees aching, still working the kind of shift that leaves no headlines behind. People trust confidence because it sounds expensive, she said quietly. Truth usually shows up wearing the wrong shoes. Dana lowered her eyes at that, just for a second, but it was enough. Richard let out the faintest breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. That may be the smartest thing anyone has said in this building all year. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a cream-colored business card, heavier stock than normal, his name embossed in dark silver. He stepped toward Alina and held it out. The gesture was small, but in that room it felt like a bridge built one plank at a time. Tomorrow morning, he said, voice steady. I want you in my office at 9, not downstairs, not in facilities, in my office. Alina didn't take the card right away. Why? She asked. It was not defiance. It was caution, earned, disciplined caution. Richard met her gaze without flinching. Because I owe you more than gratitude, he said. And because a building that can overlook someone like you is already halfway broken. The words settled deep in the silence after them. No apology speech. No dramatic repentance. Just the harder thing, the truer thing. A powerful man admitting the system that protected him had also made him unworthy of the truth standing in front of him. Alina finally accepted the card, her fingers brushing the edge of it with careful disbelief. Dana watched the exchange without speaking. The air in the room shifted again. No longer tense, not yet warm, but changed in a way that could not be undone. Richard stepped back, giving her space instead of claiming it. Go home, Ms. Brooks, he said softly. Your mother shouldn't have to finish the night wondering whether speaking up cost her daughter a future. And for the first time since she entered the boardroom, Alina felt something rarer than vindication rise quietly in her chest. Not victory, but the fragile beginning of being seen without having to bleed for it. The elevator ride down felt longer than the night itself. 32 floors of mirrored walls, soft mechanical hum, and the strange quiet that comes after a life bends in a direction you did not see coming. Alina stood beside her mother in the service elevator, the cream-colored card still resting in her palm like something too sharp and too delicate to trust. Denise Brooks glanced at her once, then at the card, then back at the metal doors without speaking. Mothers who work night shifts learn how to read silence better than most people read words. Outside, the lobby had thinned into evening stillness, marble floors glowing under recessed light, the security desk murmuring with low voices, the revolving doors carrying in faint bursts of city air that smelled like rain even though none had fallen. Alina and her mother stepped out together, their shoes clicking softly across the polished floor she had helped clean so many times before. Only tonight, the building did not feel the same. It was still tall, still expensive, still built to impress people who already had too much. But somewhere above them, on a black glass table under corporate lights, the truth had left a mark that money could not buff out by morning. At the front entrance, Denise finally spoke. Did they fire you? Alina looked down at the card, then gently closed her fingers around it. No, she said. Her voice was tired, but steadier than before. Not tonight. Denise nodded once, the smallest breath leaving her chest, and for a moment neither woman said anything else. They stepped out onto the sidewalk together. The city moved around them in ribbons of headlights and distant sirens, steam curling from a street grate half a block down, wind threading cool between the buildings. Behind the glass doors, Richard Halston still stood on the upper floor, a man with towers to his name and no peace left in his certainty. Ahead of them, the sidewalk stretched toward the subway entrance, toward home, toward a morning that had not happened yet. Alina slipped the card into her pocket and lifted her face into the night air. Sometimes justice does not arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives as a door quietly unlocked, a name finally spoken with respect, a future returning one careful inch at a time. She reached for her mother's hand, just for a second, then let go. Above them, hundreds of office windows burned against the dark, but only one mattered now. Not because it belonged to power, but because for the first time someone inside it had learned that the people most easily dismissed are often the ones carrying the truth no one else is brave enough to see. And as Alina walked beside her mother into the long New York night, the city said nothing. The wind said nothing. Even the glass tower behind her said nothing. But in that silence, something had already changed, and it would not change back.